Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos, and today I'm joined by Dr. Casey Metoyer, and we are going to be talking about everything you should know about heart rate variability or HRV. You may or may not be familiar with this term, but it is something that is assessed for if you have any type of wearable device, if you're wearing a Oura Ring or a Whoop band. I'm sure there's plenty of other wearables that are out there that are tracking this now. And you might be wondering, what does this mean? What's influencing it? How do I improve these levels so that I can be in better health and better recovery status every day? So Casey is going to tell us all about that information. Thank you so much for your time today, Casey, and welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here. Super excited to chat with you. I mean, we go back a ways, but this is a topic that really excites me. And the one thing I think I will say is that just to start us off is like with HRV, I consider myself a bit of a hobbyist in HRV because there's a lot of other people out there that have dedicated their entire lives to studying HRV. But the one thing that I do bring to the table in regards to this topic is a lot of experiential knowledge with wearables, HRV, how it applies in the practical setting, as opposed to purely just research based information. So, super excited to chat with you about all things that we can HRV related.
Yeah, no, I think that it'll be a really good conversation. And I love to just hop into really just giving an overview as to what HRV is, what is it measuring, and just really a definition, I guess, of what is heart rate variability.
Absolutely. So HRV stands for heart rate variability, as you just kind of mentioned. And with HRV, what we're essentially measuring is the time point between heartbeats. Okay. And without getting into too much of the weeds of how HRV is different from just like saying your heart rate is measured in beats per minute, right? So when somebody says my heart rate is 60 beats per minute, that is the actual unit of measurement. But that's essentially an average for that 1 minute time period. Whereas HRV, your heart rate variability, takes the time between each one of those heartbeats and measures that. And what we've come to realize through research and evaluating this is that that time between heartbeats actually changes throughout the course of 1 minute, changes throughout the course of the day, changes throughout the course of your lifetime. And so really we want to get down to the granularity of what that change is in your heart rate from beat to beat. And so that's what essentially HRV is measuring. HRV is generally reported in milliseconds. So, like I said, that time between heartbeats in milliseconds, and it's normalized, generally speaking, using a mathematical calculation, generally referred to as RMSSD. That's what you see it reported as in most often contexts. RMSSD stands for root mean square of successive differences. Once again, a bunch of math. But what you need to know is that that's reported in milliseconds. There are some other ways to measure HRV that once again gets into some of the weeds with frequency measurements and things along those lines that relate more to the electrical signal that your heart is providing. And that relates more to ECG, which we can talk about when we talk about forms of measurement for HRV. But what it all boils down to is that we are measuring the variation in your heartbeats by time over a period of time. And then that's what we're reporting. And like I said, it gets standardized, generally speaking, using that RMSSD calculation, which is where you get what most people see in their recordings of anywhere from like 10 to 200 plus milliseconds for their HRV.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it's looking at that measure all throughout the day, right? But then I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that at least with Oura Ring, it's giving you the measure that's at like 4 a.m. Is that correct? That some of these
Yeah,
different
you're spot on
wearables,
with that.
they're
So
are they giving you an average of the full
there's
day of your HRV, or is it that
a few
glimpse?
different ways to go about this, or a few different ways to look at this, right? So the original gold standard way of measuring your HRV was an ECG, an electrocardiogram, or an EKG, whatever terminology you want to use in that regard, where they would actually hook up leads on your chest, and then and the way they did this with original cardiovascular patients, because this is where HRV originally came from, and we were actually like having a brief conversation offline about accuracy and all that fun jazz. But basically, HRV was originally designed to be a measure for patients with cardiovascular disease. So they would use an ECG, and they made a portable ECG that where they would hook up leads, have you wear this pack, and then they would send you home wearing this portable ECG system, and or they would record you in the hospital, but they would record it for 24 hours. So they would have a full 24-hour HRV measurement for you, and then doctors, cardiologists could evaluate what your heart rate was over that time period, what your resting heart rate was at its lowest point throughout the day, and then what your HRV was, or what your variability looked like throughout the day. Now, back to your reference of Oura using that measure of 4 a.m., what researchers and cardiologists came to realize is that there's a lot of variation, and us as human beings have 1,000 different things going on in the day. So, how do we get a measurement of HRV that is like our baseline measurement that we can use as a standard and that removes most of the exogenous factors that are going on throughout the day? And so, this standard of, and then technology allowed us to do this as well with things like Oura rings or Whoop bands or other wearable technologies, to get this minimal noise signal of HRV that's essentially like pre-waking. And so that's where yours might be 4 a.m. Someone else's might be 2 a.m. if they wake up at 4 a.m. But anyways, all that is to say is that there's a continuous HRV measurement going on throughout the day, and these companies have now standardized, hey, we're going to capture and report your HIV in this pre-waking time period. And some companies use 10 minutes before waking, some companies use 2 hours before waking. It kind of is a little bit throughout all over the place. Some companies will even use like your lowest measurement throughout the night as they're detecting sleep. So there's kind of a moving timepiece of when companies will use and report an HRV measurement, but what's consistent across most of these companies is they're trying to find the least amount of noise in that signal and use that as your baseline HRV, with minimizing the effects of other stressors that you have going on.
Got it. Okay. That makes a ton of sense then. So there's a couple of companies we've already mentioned, Aura being one of those. What are some of the other common HRV tracking devices that are for the everyday person that aren't in this medical type setting, like you mentioned? And are there any of them that are your favorites?
Yeah, so Aura is kind of the big one that's out there. Whoop is another one that I would say probably Whoop and Aura might be the two biggest right now. Apple Watch, so Apple as a company is right there alongside those two. There are a couple other companies out there, Elite HRV and HRV for Training. Both have HRV systems that are pretty good. And then I'm trying to think. There are a couple other companies out there, but they're a little bit smaller, less well known, a little bit more niche right now, and are probably trying to gain some traction. But really, those are the biggest. And for better or for worse, Aura probably does it the best at this moment in time, and it's really kind of how they're measuring it. Um, all of these sensors have gone from an electrical ECG type measurement to a light based sensor, right? Where they're getting what's called PPG, which is has to do with pulse wave pressure, and because Aura measures it from the finger, and where that sensor is placed, it's recording it off of arterioles, or like the smallest version of your arteries, and that's going to have a better signal than your wrist based sensors that are measuring your pulse wave off of your veins, or your venules. So Aura probably does it best. And some of the literature that I've seen in regards to Aura actually has a really high correlational value with ECG. I know we had kind of jokingly said, that there was some hope of like no company doing it best. And I would say that there is probably some variation, and like accuracy is always going to be in question when it comes to any wearable, just because accuracy can mean a lot of things when you take it outside of a laboratory environment, like clean sensors, how you wear the sensor, how often you wear the sensor, does it get bumped around? Like there's all these things that are, you're going to come back to best practices when you're wearing any sort of wearable. And at the end of the day, like sensors do wear down over time. There's probably no sensor out there that isn't affected by just general use. And so, but from what I've seen right now from the wearables, especially the ones that we've mentioned, Aura is probably doing it best. Um, and it really comes back to the finger based measurements versus the wrist based measurement. So if you're going with a sensor, I think Elite HRV has a finger based sensor as well. Like I said, they're a little bit of a more like sports performance based company, as opposed to Aura and Whoop now as well has directed more of their marketing towards the everyday individual. Um, but all that to say is, if you can go with a finger based sensor, you're probably going to have better readings and better accuracy, as opposed to a wrist based sensor.
Got it. Okay. That's great to know. And maybe we can just even take a step back too and talk about, why should we even care about HRV? Like, what is this? What is the relevance and what it means for our health, and what factors and maybe are influencing this measure?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at the crux of all of this is HRV is based around what's called sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system balance, right? Which all can fall under the umbrella of autonomic nervous system balance. Okay, right? We have this autonomic nervous system, which essentially is the nervous system that controls everything that we're not uh, thinking about controlling. Basically, like our arm movements and our leg movements and all that stuff. That's outside of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system deals with our hormones. It deals with breathing. It deals with heart rate. Anything that we don't have to kind of think about on a daily basis, right? And then in under that autonomic nervous system umbrella, you get sympathetic nervous system, which I'm sure you've talked about this before in your other episodes. It gets kind of categorized as like our fight or flight, right? And then you have parasympathetic nervous system, which gets characterized as like our rest and digest, right? That's our fun filled exercise physiology 101 back in the day.
Mhm.
Um, so with those two, the HRV is essentially measuring the balance between those two. And so when we see higher HRVs, we tend to associate that with a higher parasympathetic drive, which means that we are a little bit more rest, digest, cool, calm, collected, etc. Right? Just from a characteristic standpoint. We can get into what that means from a hormonal standpoint in a little bit if we want to. But when we see lower HRVs, that usually means higher sympathetic drive, which means that maybe you're a little bit more type A, maybe you have a little more stress going on, maybe you want some stress in as associated with like exercise, or if you're in a fight or something along those lines going on that is going to drive up some of your stress hormones and or just put you in kind of a stressful state, which is not always a bad thing. I think we get caught up in this idea of when we hear the word stress, we automatically go into, oh, stress is terrible. It's not terrible, but what we want is that acute stress because that allows us to adapt. And then we want the parasympathetic nervous system to kick in, allow us to recover, and then things to kind of balance themselves out. Whereas with HRV, that's kind of what we're looking at is, do we have some acute stressors that bring our HRV down? And then do we have some rest time and recovery period that's going to bring our HRV back up? And so having that constant variation is actually a good thing. And we want to see that and that's what we care about. That's what it comes back to. That's why we're looking at our HRV. That's why we care about it. We want to be able to see, are there changes? Are there fluctuations? Is there high variability in this number? And if there is, then generally that means that your body's operating properly, I guess you can say it. The challenge with that is when people have these ultra low baseline HRVs and trying to solve the riddle behind that ultra low baseline HRV and then being able to make changes to it, which there's a lot of variability in that, pun intended on the HRV front, but that's where it all comes from. And I hope that answered your question, but
Yeah.
we can dive
No.
more into some of the nuances around that.
No, it's a really good overview. Thank you. And a really great simplification because some of this can get a little bit in the weeds with the science, right? For the everyday person. And how Dr. Metoyer and I know each other is that we worked together a few years back. And that was kind of, I would say, like maybe at the infancy of HRV, or maybe that was when HRV was like first starting to really be utilized in less of a clinical setting and more of like a high performance setting, right? And we had a coworker that we worked with, who you'll probably know who I'm talking about. And he's a very calm, cool, collected person. And he always had the highest HRV that I've ever seen in my entire life. And then on the other end, just take myself, for example, my HRV was always in the gutter. I mean, it was always, 100 points different from what his baseline was. And so, there's kind of this joke that we've made about like, can you really change HRV? Because is it a personality trait, right? Like some of us are more type A, some of us are more relaxed, laid back individuals. And so I want to get into is, how much of our programming, our personality goes into this. And I guess more so is, does this vary person to person? Like is his HRV baseline going to be higher because that's the way his body functions versus mine? And should I be comparing my HRV to his, or should I be comparing my HRV to my own HRV?
Yeah. So all of that is great, and all of that's perfect background to as a jumping off of this wonderful rabbit hole that we can go down. But the long story short of that is, I think you already kind of hit the nail on the head with, you cannot compare your HRV to somebody else's, right? There's just so much individualization in this metric. And that's why a lot of companies, or at least some companies, have sought to like bring some level of normalization utilizing arithmetic, utilizing logarithmic change and things along those lines to the HRV world. And But it's always comes back to this same deal, right? Is like it's the variability between your own heart rates. And the interesting part, right? Well, I would say the interesting part between that specific reference and that specific example that you gave is the coworker that we worked. Well, one, HRV is typically on average lower in males, so that's an interesting thing.
Hmm.
The flip side to that, which we'll get into like hormones and things along those lines, but the flip side to that is testosterone does actually promote a higher HRV. So there's a lot of like nuance, and as we know, the body does this wonderful thing of it'll tell you one thing and then it'll counteract it with another. But all that is to say is that HRV is highly individualized. And where you're going to gain the most value out of HRV is tracking your own individual changes. So if your HRV sits at 100 or your baseline HRV is at 100 and it goes up, then you're probably doing something of value to drive that up, whether it's being fitter, whether it's in a more restful state, whether it's a meditation practice, whatever that looks like, you bumping that number up is to your benefit. And we could talk about why that is here in a second. And it all comes back to fitness and mortality risk and some of the research associated with HRV. But if you see that number slide down, then we know that there's something going on, and there's your autonomic balance is kind of out of whack, right? And that could be a decrease in fitness, that could be increased strain or load, or like you're going through a harder training period, that could be more stress, you don't like your boss, whatever that is, anything along those lines. But what matters is that you're tracking your baseline, you know what your average is, and you know what the fluctuations look like in that HRV on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis.
Sure. Okay. So you said that it's really individualized and we really should be comparing our own measure to our own measure, right? And really
Yeah.
understanding what our baseline is and then what variables are increasing that baseline or driving down that baseline. However, my next question is there a low end threshold? I think I've seen a study before. I don't know how much literature is back on this because I don't dive into this quite the extent that you do. But somewhere around 20, I believe, is what I saw was kind of like that's the lowest you ever want to be. Is that correct? Or is there not really a low end threshold?
There, yes and no is the answer.
Okay.
Um, the I think the actual research that I've seen had the number in the lower teens or lower teens, I would say. I think it was like 14 was once you go below 14, your risk of mortality significantly increases. Now, I don't want to scare anybody out there. So, and once again, I'm not an MD. So please consult your healthcare practitioner if your HRV is there or in that neighborhood, right? But the research that I've read has like once you're below 14 or in those low teens and potentially in a single digit, hopefully nobody's there, but if you are, then I would be getting a hold of a doctor or a cardiologist.
Got it. Okay. And you've mentioned mortality risk a couple of times. What is the correlation between HRV and mortality or lifespan, I suppose?
Say that again. I'm sorry, you broke up.
You've mentioned the correlation between HRV and mortality a few times. What is the correlation? Do we know that people that have a lower HRV have a higher risk for mortality, have a higher mortality risk?
Yes. Yeah. So, and like I said, it's really more associated with that low end. Now, with that said, age has a high negative correlation with HRV in the sense that the older you get, the more your HRV decreases. So there is that, right? But we also know that in general, with muscle mass and with VO2 max or aerobic fitness in general, if you were to do nothing, then those numbers are going to decrease as you get older anyways. Now, obviously, if you remain healthy and fit and active, then there are some protective benefits to those where you may be able to minimize some of the decreases that are associated with essentially cardiovascular function and age. So there is a little bit of nuance to that, but like that's a pretty well understood point in the regards to cardiovascular function, cardiovascular fitness, and its relationship to age. HRV moves in the same manner that heart rate, aerobic fitness, et cetera, do. So now, in regards to mortality specifically, it is primarily centered around that lower end threshold. Like I said, 14, I think was the number, if I recall correctly. And then once you're above that, the risk diminishes. And I think there was less and less and less and less of an association the further you got away from that number.
Got it. Okay. That's awesome to know. Okay. And you mentioned a couple times as well that our fitness level can impact this number. Do we know that is there evidence that certain populations, like people that are athletes or that exercise more often, generally have a higher HRV?
Yeah, so fitness in general is one of the going to be one of the primary kind of drivers of HRV. Drivers is not the word I really want to use there. It's going to be one of the dials for it, right? So for the most part, the more fit you are, usually the higher HRV you have, and the less fit you are, usually the lower HRV you have. Now, that is associated, like I said, primarily with you're going to have that your baseline measure there, right? So somebody, and like our coworker, will use that as an example, right? I want to say his baseline HRV was like 200, right? Which is higher than mine. And I would like to believe, and take this for whatever it's worth, but I would like to believe that my fitness level was higher than his at any one given point in time, but his HRV was always higher than mine. So, you've got to once again, going back to our previous comment of like, you start from your own baseline, and then with fitness you can kind of drive that HRV up or down based on what your fitness status is. And once again, going back to some generalizations and using kind of like mean population variable samples, if you took a population of athletes, their mean or average HRV is going to be higher than the average population of sedentary people. So, yes, fitness matters in this equation. It's most important when you are evaluating your own HRV and looking at changes in that number.
Sure. Okay. And outside of physical fitness and your maybe cardiovascular health due to exercise, what are some other factors that both positively and negatively influence HRV? Maybe we can start with things that positively influence it, and then we can get into some of the things that may bring down that baseline number.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the things that positively influence HRV are probably well, maybe on both sides of the fence, right? They're somewhat commonplace, right? Like we talked about fitness, back to, and this may be a little bit cliche at this point in time, but I think it still is valuable to mention having a meditation practice, having a mindfulness practice, and those can be two separate things. They can be one and the same, is what it is. But those two things separately, I think, are interesting in driving that number. Once again, positively affecting HRV or pushing HRV up. I think having a healthy sleep practice, having adequate nutrition, hydration is another one. And I'm sure you've talked about this before on your podcast, but dehydration has a pretty significant effect on the heart and heart function. And so being adequately and or properly hydrated is going to have an effect on HRV. Um, those are kind of the bulk of the things that are going to positively associate it. And there might be some other things that come up. Obviously, stress, depending on how you want to look at stress, stress in general is going to lower your HRV, but acute doses of regular stress, followed by some recovery period, in general, will have a positive effect on your HRV because you have that adaptation to it, right? And when I say stress, right, that could be related back to exercise, or that could be related to one of the other things that is interesting is like cold exposure, right? So cold exposure is essentially a stress, but cold exposure has been seen to have some positive benefits on your HRV. So this is where this new fad of ice baths, right, or cold showers has really kind of taken off. And really that comes back to it's an acute stress that has a sympathetic response, right? You get some of your stress hormones flooding the system, gives you an increase in heart rate, but then you have a period of rest, relaxation, and recovery, and then concomitant adaptation to that stressor, which then gives you a boost in your HRV over the long run, and using that chronic adaptation theory. So that's kind of the bulk of the things that have a positive effect on your HRV. And as far as the negative things, it's really almost some of the opposites of those, right? Chronic stress is going to be the biggest effector of HRV in the sense of driving it downwards. And then really, I mean, kind of what we've seen is that HRV also has a large role in like your emotions, right? So anything that you see as stressful is going to have potentially a negative effect on your HRV. I mean, your genetics, medications, things along those lines can affect HRV as well. I kind of talked about hydration versus dehydration. And then really just going back to this idea of like chronic stress, and a part of chronic stress could also be overtraining, right? If you are doing way too much high intensity exercise or way too much exercise period and not allowing a recovery period, you could see some chronically low levels of HRV. Now, when you give yourself some time to rest, recover, you should see that HRV bounce back up. What that time period looks like will depend on the individual and what level of overtraining they're at. But I think that's kind of the major things. And I know I didn't touch on a ton when it comes to what could lower HRV, but really stress and emotion management is going to be the big like driver or effector of HRV from a negative standpoint. The other one, fun-filled one, is going to be alcohol. And alcohol. The interesting part about alcohol is it's so multifaceted in how it could negatively impact your HRV that it almost ends up in its own category, because you have a dehydration effect there, you have a temperature change with alcohol, and then you have just the toxin that is entering your body, that which leads to some of the inflammatory effects, which we haven't talked about, which I think is a really interesting area to explore, because of all of your work in inflammation and inflammatory syndrome. But the inflammatory effects of alcohol, also kind of those big three pieces, will also really drive down your HRV. And I'll be the first one to say the number one thing that I see my HRV plummet, and this is like significantly, like more than a standard deviation, is alcohol. Like I could have a drink or two and I'll look at my HRV the next day and that thing will be in the dirt. So alcohol is a major negative effector of your HRV.
Yeah, I see that with mine as well. And even just a couple of sips, like even if I don't have a full glass, it's pretty crazy how much it impacts things. And I've done a lot of research and experimentation with this over the years to find what brings my HRV up. And truth be told, I've never really stuck to a meditation practice consistently enough, something I always wish I could be better at. But it's just one of the hardest things for me to do consistently. But the one thing that always gives me a good spike of about 20 points is getting a massage. So I found that to help boost things up. It's a transient, it only works for about a week or two, but it just shows you the impact of being in more of that parasympathetic state, right? And helping bring down those stress hormones. And so I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between cortisol and HRV. Are they a one-to-one relationship? Like, can we expect that, you mentioned that chronic stress is going to deplete our HRV, right? Or it's going to drop it. So could we expect that if our HRV is lower, that our body may be also releasing a lot of that cortisol, that stress hormone?
Yeah. So, you pretty much can expect that, right? So cortisol is pretty much well associated with a lower HRV. And one of the things that we've have to consider in this regard is that HRV is exactly kind of what we already talked is one of the things we already talked about is, right, it's going to be a display of our autonomic balance, right? And we know that if cortisol is up, in general, cortisol is associated with a stress response. And really, and you as the expert could speak to this, is like one of the main things that cortisol does is free up fuel for our body to use in regards to that stress response, right? But what that's associated with is like that fight or flight, that stressful situation. And so when cortisol gets dumped into the bloodstream, usually that's alongside some of the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which all of that goes back to sympathetic tone in regards to the HRV. So sympathetic tone is higher, which is then going to pull your HRV down, which I think maybe sliding back into the science of it. So sympathetic tone basically means that it's standardizing your heart rate. So these hormones are increasing your heart rate, which is standardizing the frequency at which your heart beats, which then means lower variability. So that's where sympathetic drive and sympathetic tone will decrease your HRV. And so that's kind of what's going on when we're talking about a lower HRV, higher sympathetic tone, et cetera, et cetera.
Got it. Okay. So this is a really cool at-home metric, and I always like to share on the podcast things you can do without having all of the advanced lab testing. I'm a huge fan of advanced lab testing, but it's good to have some at-home measures that we can just really check in on a day-to-day basis. And I think that HRV is a really great tool for that, to assess, are we in this like high cortisol, high stress state? You probably know when you are, right? You could feel that intuitively. But sometimes you can't feel the effects of these other sources of stress, like you mentioned, the stress of exercise, the stress of dehydration, the stress of inadequate nutrition, right? So it may be a helpful way to assess more than just that psychological stress that you feel. And one of the things that has really come about in the last year is that a lot of these companies like Oura are syncing with cycle tracking information like natural cycles to be able to help women track their menstrual cycle. And one of the things that we see with the menstrual cycle is that when women get into that luteal phase, which is that second half of the menstrual cycle where progesterone is made thanks to ovulation, we see a big drop in HRV and a big spike in resting heart rate. And I would love to just talk a little bit about some of these like natural fluctuations that happen with the menstrual cycle in women. And maybe there's even things that you can share too about men. And I don't know if you've seen a fluctuation with like men's testosterone levels, if you've ever looked into that and HRV and things of that sort. But I'm just really curious to hear more and share more with our listeners about the role that some of these hormones may have in HRV.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I always would note in regards to this is you being a female, and to all the females out there listening, is you guys are the experts of your own body and you guys know what's going on, even though half the time you're going to be like, I don't know what's going on. If you sit down, if you listen, if you pay attention, and then you are the expert of your own body. So I will not be the one to be able to tell you what's going on with all of that. You are the expert, okay? And I tell that to my wife too. She's like, I don't understand what's happening right now. I'm like, listen, you do understand what's happening. You just need to, you need some more information to be able to describe it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, for sure. So, but with all that said, you hit the nail on the head with your explanation. Is in the with the follicular phase, we do see higher HRVs associated in that phase. And specifically, and in regards to that, we also see higher HRVs associated with estrogen in general, right? So estrogen tends to be a little bit more cardioprotective, I think is what we call it. And so we do see higher HRVs associated with higher estrogen levels. The interesting play with that, and not to go off on too much of a tangent because I want to come back to the luteal phase and all of that, but or actually I'll just hit luteal phase real quick. The interesting play is we also see high or lower HRVs with progesterone. So that phasical shift makes perfect sense when it comes to HRV. Now, why exactly that is, there's probably a large interplay of different dynamics and different things going on. What drives that? I think one of the things that we can say is that we do associate those two hormones with those two shifts in HRV and heart rate response. I think we also need to remember is that HRV tends to be a response metric. So it doesn't really preclude any potential outcomes, if you will. So it tends to change in response to something else going on. There are some interesting interplays, and I have a couple other theories in regards to what it might preclude. But we can talk about that later because that's a different subject. But what I was going to talk about just prior to talking about progesterone and it's having kind of a lowering effect on HRV is what I had mentioned earlier is testosterone tends to increase HRV. So there is this interesting interplay where usually you see testosterone and estrogen have these kind of like uh, negative or kind of like not compounding effects, but they kind of like butt heads in one sense, right? But that really doesn't play out when it comes to how it affects HRV and how it affects the cardiovascular system in general. So there's not really a great response to, hey, like testosterone does this and estrogen does this. They both tend to have some cardioprotective effects, and they both tend to increase HRV, in their own ways. So there's some interesting effects there. Now, with all that said, I think from a menstrual phase standpoint, I find it really interesting that we do, one, see those changes. The changes make perfect sense in regards to estrogen and progesterone and the phasical shift there. What I would further suggest, and this is actually a very I have an extremely high interest level in this, and I was moving towards doing this with some of my athletes when I was working directly with female athletes, is structuring and or trying to structure your training in regards to some of that menstrual cycle shift. And HRV is just another metric that we can use to that. I mean, we know pretty clearly that some of the hormone shifts are going to facilitate different phases of training, and there's a better time in that menstrual cycle to do some power training and do some explosive work, and then there's a better time to do some higher volume and lower intensity work, and utilizing that information alongside HRV could really be a benefit to women and how they structure their training. Now, obviously, like, utilize the experts you have around you. Once again, you are the expert of your own body. You know what's going on. So if something doesn't feel right, then act on those types of things. But utilize the information to the best of your capability, and then also work with some of the experts that are potentially around you to maximize your training, essentially. Because I think one of the things, once again, this is going back to my time working with athletes, is one of the things that we did is I think we butted our heads against the wall all too often when we were asking some of our females to do some really high intensity exercise when their bodies were just suggesting that they weren't prepared for that high intensity exercise. And it would have been that much easier if we had HRV one, because we could use shifts of HRV to guide us in that, but then alongside some of the menstrual cycle phasing to help guide some of the training decisions that we were making.
Yeah, totally. And I think that it's a really great way to work with your body, not against your body, is kind of what you're getting at, right? Which I'm such a big fan of, is that once you kind of understand the way that your unique body works based off genetics and physiology and things, then you can work so much smarter rather than harder and get such a better response out of it. And I love using HRV in practice. I love reviewing this type of data with clients we work with, for example, because it helps you be able to understand your body and what your body's needs are better. And I really think that it helps you to be able to, for example, when I look at my data and I see that my HRV is down and my temperature is up, I'm like, okay, I know I'm in the luteal phase. I know I ovulated. And so if I wake up and I feel exhausted, or I'm feeling, extra sore, and I'm just not feeling my best, it more is just an affirmation of, this is why you feel that way. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing to worry about. You're not going to feel this way forever. Give yourself a week or 10 days. It's going to come back around. You're going to feel great again in a week. And it just more is that peace of mind, for me at least, that it serves as, is knowing the why and having the data to back up the way that I'm feeling and not feeling crazy.
100%. You nailed it. And so much of what we do on a daily basis, and this goes for everybody, I can speak to this, just as well as anyone from a male perspective, is like, so much of what we do on a daily basis, we just need a little bit of confirmation that what we're feeling is accurate. Because the amount of times I've been like, God, I feel like crap today, but you know what? I'm just going to suck it up and go with it. Right. Like, no, if I was using HRV or another metric to tell me, hey, like, I've got shit going on, then that's a confirmation that maybe we shouldn't have a high intensity training day, or that I am feeling as bad as I think I am. Or on the flip side, maybe I'm not feeling as bad as I think I am, and I can train that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your body's not impacted maybe as much by the way that you feel.
Yeah.
Or I wonder too if there's, and I don't know if you know this, but if there's some residual effect, does it take like 3 days of feeling stress or 3 days of, feeling under the weather for your HRV to be impacted, or is it pretty acute?
Yeah, that's a great question. And no, there is a residual effect. I think the magnitude of this, well, the stressor itself is dependent, right? Like whether it's an illness, training adaptation, like a test or a hard day at work, etc. Depending on the stress and then depending on the magnitude of that stress, the other wild card in all this is how you perceive that stress. Um, is all of those will play a factor in what the time course is of your HRV to change, right? Usually we have this like 3 to 7 day window. But like I said, the magnitude of the stress and then the perception of that stress will have an effect on what the residuals of that look like.
Got it. Okay. And you mentioned a little bit earlier about the role of our emotions and how our emotions go into our parasympathetic and sympathetic state. And so I can assume, but maybe you have more information you can share on this, that if we're feeling more anxious or that if we've experienced things like trauma, if we're dealing with depression, that might influence our HRV number. Is that correct?
Yeah, 100%. Really, for better or for worse, we've seen that HRV is highly influenced and maybe more so influenced by our emotional state and or stressors, right? But emotional state being the specific topic here, it may be more influenced by emotional state than it is by like fitness. And that now I know that is a bit counterintuitive to what I had said previously, but the what it boils down to is that like the fitness is very predictable, and how it affects your HRV is very predictable, whereas emotional state and like you said, anxiety, depression, etc., are very unpredictable. And
Yeah.
so how those we know that they have a negative effect on your HRV, but the magnitude of that negative effect is very, very dependent on the individual. The time course of that, once again, very, very dependent on the individual. And then once again, like back to the concept of like perception around those emotions is obviously very, very individualized. So we know that they are going to affect your HRV. And in general, a generalization again is that they're going to have a negative effect or they're going to lower your HRV. Now, how much is, you know, you, there's no telling. You just need to track this on your own and then utilize some of the tools at your disposal, whether that be medical practitioners, medications, or food, once again a meditation practice, mindfulness, etc., to modulate and or affect evaluate your HRV and the response that you have to it.
Okay. So as it relates to, everyone wants to know like what can I do to boost my HRV and what are the best tools to be able to get it up? Do you feel like there's anything across the board that you've seen work for the majority of individuals, or do you feel like that's something that's highly N of one? Like you have to do some experimentation and try a few things to see what is going to have the most magnitude for you?
No, so my short response to this, and this goes back to maybe my wife's question here, but my short response to this is cardiovascular training, right? Like that's going to be and you know referencing my previous statement, that's going to have the most predictable effects on your HRV. Now, what's unpredictable is, back to my previous reference, magnitude, right? Like I can't sit here and tell you if you do 60 minutes of zone 2 cardiovascular training 4 days a week for the next 8 weeks that is going to boost your HRV by 100 milliseconds. Like
Mm.
we just can't say that, because even in highly controlled um, laboratory based research, the individual adaptations to a controlled fitness program are all over the place, right? Like everybody adapts differently to the same program. It's actually a really wild phenomenon, but it goes back to like a little bit of like, we are all kind of snowflakes in our own special way. I also don't love that reference, but it's the fact of the matter is that we adapt differently to the same stimuli, right? And there's so many things that play in that we could spend 6 hours on this podcast trying to elucidate all those different factors. But what we can say is that everybody adapts differently to the same program. But we can say that there is an adaptation there. So my go-to is cardiovascular fitness is going to be your most predictable positive lever that you can pull or push, however you want to describe that, when it comes to HRV. Having a cardiovascular fitness program is going to push that number up. How much? There is probably a bit of a dose response relationship that is a bit of a J curve, but at the end of the day, we can say that cardiovascular fitness program is going to be the most positive lever you can push to push that HRV up.
Mm.
Now, alongside that, I think the second one that people that have more and more research is evolving is like a meditation, is once again like a meditation or a mindfulness practice. I'm with you in that I have found it very, very challenging to have a steady meditation practice. I'm a little bit better on the mindfulness side. It's easier for me to kind of like put myself in a situation and try and listen to my thoughts, or like journaling. I wrap that all into this mindfulness bucket, or just trying to realize like what's going on in my head and try and figure out why those things are going on in my head. That's a little bit easier. When it comes to sitting down and doing meditation, I found that challenging, but that is my New Year's goal. To be the New Year's resolutionist over here, but there's just so much positive research that I'm like, I've got to find a way to tap into this. And so like my goal for 2024 is to find some level of meditation practice that works. I actually really like the Calm app for helping me get into sleep, but I'm not associated with Calm or anything along those lines. I just have used their app for helping me sleep or helping me get into sleep, because otherwise my mind spins up and that's a whole nother deal. But those are the two kind of biggest things, right? Having cardiovascular fitness, regular cardiovascular fitness, and then, like I said, the meditation, journaling, mindfulness is another one that like repeatedly comes up when it comes to HRV. And I think maybe a nuance on this, and sorry to, sit here and kind of like word vomit a little bit, but one of the things that I think you could call it a confounding factor in that is that breath. Breath is so powerful when it comes to your autonomic balance, because even just breathing in and breathing out, the rate at which your heart rate is beating changes. So you literally have inter breath changes in the pace of your heart rate, right? So HRV changes inter breath, right? And so my thought is that a lot of the meditation practice is centered around breathing. And so there's probably some confounding factors around breath control and breath practice that's associated with the meditation. But a lot of that also comes back to just like de-stressing, right? So there's a lot of things being interwoven into this meditation bubble, but because of the power of your breath and its effects on um, cardiac function and autonomic activity, I think that is where my mind goes. But that's also because I like a concrete answer to things. So I'm going to lean on breath.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And as you said that, I found myself even just reminding myself to breathe. So I think we all need that reminder from time to time, right? To just breathe and slow down our breath and become more aware of our breath. So thank you. That's super
Mm-hmm.
helpful. You mentioned earlier, I just want to make sure I ask you before we wrap up that you have some thoughts on what HRV, what HRV could cause, I suppose, in the body. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what your thoughts are there.
Yeah. Well, one of these things, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine, Andrew Flat, I would actually say is like a true expert in HRV. Like he has basically devoted his whole life to HRV research. So if anybody wants to follow Andrew Flat, FLATT on Twitter, by all means you should. If you want to go down the research rabbit hole of HRV. I'm here more to get you some practical examples and hopefully give you some ideas of how you can use it in your everyday life. But all that is to say, I was having a really interesting conversation with him, and and my question for him was, if you have a higher baseline HRV, um, does that mean that you potentially have a higher propensity to adapt to training? And so part of where I was going with this is like, I've seen some of these really high level CrossFitters that put out their HRV and they're in like the 200s, 300s. Granted, like some of these individuals are the most fit people in the world, right? And so, or could be seen as the most fit people in the world. And but it still was a thought process of like, okay, you have a 200 or a 300 HRV at baseline, where can that go? And he actually posted a research paper the other day where um, baseline HRV, higher baseline HRV was associated with individuals' ability to adapt to an aerobic exercise program over a period of 8 weeks. And so I thought so essentially some of my hypothesis there got verified via that study, because I was like, I feel like higher HRV has to mean something other than your heart rate just fluctuates at a higher rate, or you're just a super chill, hang loose kind of an individual, right? Especially in the athletic performance sense. So all that is to say is, if you are one of those people that are gifted with a high baseline HRV, you should probably look into some high level cardiovascular fitness programs, because you might be predisposed to adapt really well to them. But
Interesting.
um, yeah, so it was a really interesting. When I saw the paper, I was like, I felt so verified. I was like,
Yeah.
yes. Um,
Well, always be a
but
strength
that was
athlete.
exactly. But I think I also would caution, throw the asterisks on that, is like, if you are a person that is not gifted with a very high baseline HRV, don't take that as like, hey, I can't move the needle, so why do cardiovascular fitness? Like, cardiovascular fitness is clearly proven to have a wealth of benefits beyond just like pushing your HRV up 10 milliseconds. So in my opinion, everybody should undertake a cardiovascular fitness program that suits them, for, like I said, the wealth of benefits that can be associated with it.
Sure. Okay. Wonderful. Well, gosh, this
Yeah.
was so fascinating. And I know it's going to answer so many questions for everyone out there. We talked about it a little bit offline, right? But they really took this extremely clinical, kind of confusing model of interpretation and implemented it into everyday use when it came to things like these wearables. And I think sometimes it's a little bit confusing for people to really understand, like, what does this even mean? Why is it changing? Is this good? Is this bad? And sometimes it can even become stressful for people, right? Where it feels like they did something wrong or they're not healthy because their HRV is bad. So I hope that this episode really provides you with a lot of answers to those questions, and really just empowerment, and hopefully eases your mind if you are someone that maybe has a lower HRV, about things that may be going into that, and what you can do to be able to support that. But Casey, I'd love if you would just tell us a little bit about where people can learn more about your work, what you're currently spending your time in the lab researching, and some of the services that you provide as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me throw out one additional thing because I think this is particularly interesting in regards to your space, Lauren. But one of the other things, and I slightly touched on it earlier, but one of the other things that we've seen is kind of like a growing field surrounding HRV is this idea of like inflammation syndrome, and there's some very like clear associations with inflammation and lower HRV. Now, inflammation can present itself in 1,000 different ways. One of the pieces, or one of the diagnoses that has also been a cascade in this inflammation syndrome continuum is this concept is COVID and or long COVID. And once again, not an MD, no, and I don't play one here on this podcast, but something I was reading and or listening to was some of the effects associated with long COVID can be summarized in inflammation syndrome. And so there could just be some lasting inflammation there. There's also obviously inflammation that's associated, and Lauren, we've talked about, gut health and all of those and all the things and all the inflammation pieces that surround gut health. And we've talked about that probably at nauseum, but it is always a continuing like discussion because like there's mornings where I wake up and like my wrist is cranky and I'm like, I know for a fact that's inflammation, and that's probably related to the 7 pieces of sourdough bread that I ate the other day or something along those lines, right? So I find that just being a really interesting area, and it goes back to something that you're a big proponent of, Lauren, which is don't guess, test, and I'm a huge proponent of that as well. And then also just continuing to utilize the information that's at your disposal. And if you're working through what you think might be some inflammatory markers or some inflammatory symptoms, like evaluating your HRV in that, I think one of the things, and me and my wife talk about this, is like after a meal, right? Like how's your body feeling? And if you have HRV, if you have negative HRV effects after that meal, whether that be a day or 12 hours later or something like that, you see your HRV kind of plummet in regards to that, then there might be some inflammation going on. And once again, that could be a 3 to 7 day window. But if you're feeling something, then is it worth like acknowledging and looking into the information that you have at hand? Now, is that going to relate to everybody? No, but it definitely relates to a lot of people that are out there, and probably more people than they realize. So I just wanted to throw out the inflammation piece because we touched on it, but I don't think we dove down that rabbit hole, which it's probably not. It probably gets a little bit heavy, and it can be too generalizable. But I think it's at least worth acknowledging that inflammation does have a negative association with HRV, and that can present itself in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. And this podcast is going to release just after our first launch of my new program that's called Inflammation Hormone. And it's essentially why I created that program, was because the more and more cases I worked with, the more that I realized that the underlying root cause of so many hormone imbalances, whether it's insulin resistance or it's high androgens, it's high cortisol, it's low progesterone levels, really is rooted in this high inflammatory load. And inflammation can come from a lot of things. Like you mentioned, it can be, the stress of what's affecting your HRV. It can be what you're eating. It can be, how things are influencing your gut. But I think that inflammation is such a big tool that we can really use to be able to optimize everything down to even our HRV as well. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And I really, really appreciate that. Just going back to just some of the research you're doing, Casey, tell us a little bit about what you're currently interested in, what you guys are researching, and a little bit about some of the services you offer.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, I'm at the University of Notre Dame as a sports scientist. So all the research that we're doing right now is kind of centered around the athlete, heavily involved in a hamstring injury index research study right now, where we're looking to essentially create an indices that can predict or provide risk tolerance for hamstring injury. Hamstring injury is the number one highest time loss injury for field-based sport athletes. So we're trying to help elucidate that. We're actually working, that's in partnership with a number of other different universities, but super interesting. The other couple other ones, we are also writing a study actually using Oura rings and some of the sleep and heart rate metrics in some of our athletes. It's more observational in nature and descriptive in nature, really just kind of reporting how sleep and heart rate change throughout the course of a season with a couple of our football athletes. And then let's see what else we got. We also do a counter movement jumps on force plates on a daily basis, essentially with our entire athlete population. So we're writing a study that talks about counter movement jump characteristics and their relationship with some of our GPS variables, so like speed, distance, etc. And then last but not least, we're doing a acute to chronic workload ratio paper as well, which gets into a little bit of the nuance of sport and science, and we don't need to dive into all that, but all of those are on their way towards being completed and hopefully published in the next year or so, hopefully in the next like 6 months. But the publication timeline is a little bit wonky, and I don't want to bore your listeners with all of that, but that's what we have on the table right now. That's probably not to say what we are or are not interested in. We're interested in everything when it comes to performance and trying to provide a competitive edge to our athletes. Me personally, am hoping to be able to do a little bit more in regards to HRV and aerobic fitness. So potentially looking at some of our high-end aerobic athletes and HRV and their HRVs, both from like a baseline standpoint throughout training. So we'll see how that kind of plays itself out. And then outside of that, I do have my own remote training business or company that I'm working that I work with my own athletes on a daily basis. I carry a handful at a time just to make sure that I can provide the highest quality and attention to those athletes. And we can work through anything that we need to work through, whether that be programming or it be some of these more nuanced things like HRV or heart rate or hormone regulation or anything along those lines. I generally don't take on a massive load, but I do take on 5 to 10 at any one point in time. But really, I limit myself so that I can provide the highest quality possible.
Yeah, and you are the best of the best, Casey. And I always love having real in depth conversations with you. And I miss our scientific rabbit holes that we would go down. So yeah, for anyone that's listening and is interested in learning more about working with Casey and really going into the weeds, like Casey's really good at just if you want to do things at a really high level, like you're not just like, I want a good workout program, but you really want to you want to do things at a high level. Casey's a really great person for that. So we'll put all of his contact information in the show notes below, and super excited to hear about those studies you guys have got going too. Those all sound awesome and relevant to today's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm super appreciative once again for you having me on. I think this was a super fun topic to dive into. I think I would once again like I'm a hobbyist in this zone. I do love HRV and I love what it gives you, what it tells you, and what it can do in this realm. There is plenty of research out there and some real high level clinicians in regards to this topic. But I think once again, what I bring to the table is just my ability to be able to interpret it and bring it to anyone's level, hopefully. So once again, thank you so much for having me on. I miss our rabbit holes as well, being out on the training room floor. And next thing you know, 30 minutes later, we're in a conversation that could go anywhere. So this has been fun. We got to do it again soon.
Yeah, it's a good refresh for sure. Well, thank you again,
For sure.
Casey, for your time, and best of luck with all this research that you're doing right now too. And we will catch you sometime soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.